to order. It is 1:30 by my phone. I would ask everyone to mute their microphones and only turn them on when you speak. Due to the nature of the meeting, it would be very, very helpful if you could state your name before you do make a comment so that it could be appropriately recorded and makes it a little easier to track as well. Now I want to go on and do the roll call. Angelica, would you mind doing the roll call for us, please?
Yes, sir. Lance Brooks, presiding officer.
Here.
Jackie Cooper. Mr. Richard Davila.
Here.
Mr. Gary Hahn.
Here.
Miss Amy Trost.
Here.
TJ McDowell. Deidre Stewart. Mr. Dustin Potter.
Here.
And Dr. James Fuller. Mr. Brooks, you have a quorum.
Excellent. Thank you. We certainly appreciate Mr. Dusty Potter joining the board. Dusty, would you want to tell us a few interesting things about yourself?
Oh, I'm sure it's all interesting. So I'm Dusty Potter. I'm from Wichita Falls, Texas. I own a practice here called Wichita Falls Hearing. Formerly owned a larger practice called Hearing Aid Express. I've been in the profession for a good 20 years at this point and know most of you folks, with the exception of the staff. So anyway, happy to be here and thank you for having me. Excited to be here. So.
Thank you very much. Certainly the time I've known you, I've been very impressed and always learn a lot. And we appreciate the knowledge you'll bring to this board. So thank you.
Thank you.
Also, the minutes were distributed with the materials for the board. Hopefully everyone had a chance to look over that. Would there be a motion to approve the minutes?
Richard Davila, move to approve the minutes as listed from September the 24th, 2019.
Thank you, Mr. Davila.
Amy Trost, second.
Ms. Trost has a second. Angelica, would you mind polling the board members for their vote?
Yes, sir. Mr. Lance Brooks, presiding officer.
Agreed.
Mr. Richard Davila.
Yes, agreed.
Mr. Gary Hahn.
Yes, agreed.
Miss Amy Trost.
Agree.
And Mr. Dustin Potter.
Agreed.
Your motion passes, Mr. Brooks.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mhm.
Also, the next item on the agenda is the public comment. The members of the public have the opportunity to either submit a comment via email or to request to appear to the board. We have received one public comment via email. These will not be read during the meeting, but have been given to the board members. Would there be any comments about any of that from anyone? I believe the materials were not directly apropos to the meeting at hand, as I understand.
It was a doozy.
Okay. If there's not any comments, then let's move on to item E, discussion regarding the purpose of the waivers granted by the governor.
Real quick, Lance, Richard Davila, real quick. Is that something that makes the agenda the next time? Or, you know, when you have a public comment, is it something that we're going to discuss at some point, or do you determine
Mary
that?
Winston, TDLR. Mr. Davila, if this is a request for a topic for the next meeting, that's something that we can do. If that's something you're interested in, and as always, and for Dustin, Mr. Potter, if you have a topic that you want before the board, you can email advisory.boards@tdlr.texas.gov, or you can say so here, and we will include that if possible as a topic for next time.
Well, yeah, I think it's a great topic, so I'd like to discuss it. Yeah.
So, Angelica, do we have? We'll work on that for you. Okay. Katie.
This is Katie Bryce with RPM, and I'd also like to mention that that might be something, if it's on the agenda, that the advisory board would like to refer to the education and examination work group to further review.
Okay.
Do we need a motion of any kind in order to do that, or is that something we can just ask them to take a look at? I see a thumbs up. I assume that means we can, Mr. Francis is saying that we can just refer that to that work group.
Presiding Officer Brooks, you are correct. It's just referred to the work group at your discretion, and we move on.
Very good. Let's do so. Any other comments on that topic then? All right, well then, if it's okay, let's move on to item E. Discussion regarding the purpose of the waivers granted by the governor during the COVID-19 pandemic and the proposed emergency rulemaking to ensure continuity of services to clients through telehealth. Ms. Wendy Pello was going to update us on that, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon. I'm Wendy Pello, Senior Assistant General Counsel. This agenda item, we wanted to kind of brief you on kind of the waivers that were granted during the COVID-19 pandemic and the emergency rulemaking that's on the agenda for today. This meeting is a little different and has a very narrow focus in terms of what this advisory board meeting is. We also wanted to kind of discuss the waivers and the emergency rulemaking because those are items and procedures and processes that aren't used very often. And so a lot of folks are not familiar with that. It's not kind of our usual rulemaking process and how that works. So we wanted to give you a little briefing on that and have that discussion under agenda item E before we got to agenda item F, which is the specific emergency rules. Regarding the waivers, how that works is on March 13th of 2020, the governor issued a disaster declaration or proclamation regarding COVID-19 and that it was an imminent threat and disaster for all counties in Texas. So that disaster declaration or proclamation is still in effect. As part of that, the governor's powers when a disaster declaration is issued, the governor has the authority to temporarily suspend or waive, kind of referred to it commonly as waiver, but it's a temporary suspension of, and that he can waive a state agency's statutes and rules if strict compliance would anyway prevent, hinder, or delay necessary action in coping with that disaster. So TDLR, along with many state agencies, had, in response to COVID-19, had requested waivers of particular statutes and rules in terms to be able to continue services, to continue keep operating in light of COVID-19. One of the waivers that TDLR had requested from the governor was a telehealth waiver related to our health programs. And it was for purposes of making sure that services could continue to be provided to clients during COVID-19, when especially initially when there were shutdowns, businesses were closing, people were staying home. We wanted to make sure they could do that. So we had submitted on March 22nd a waiver. I'm sorry, Chairman Brooks, do you have your hand up for a question? Okay.
I think his connection might be going out.
Oh. Wasn't sure what that little symbol was.
Yeah, Mary Winston, TLR, that means he's having some connectivity issues. It doesn't mean he's gone per se, but he can't come in at the moment. So we'll keep working in the background to get him up.
Okay. I wasn't sure if that was a hand raised. All right. So on March 22nd, 2020, TLR did submit a waiver request requesting certain statutes and rules for our health programs be waived. For the hearing instrument fitters and dispensers, statute rules or rules under Chapter 112, we were seeking to remove any restrictions and be able to expand the provision of services through telehealth. The waivers, in terms of the rule waivers, allowed for the use of additional technologies to be able to provide telehealth services in terms of smartphones, any two-way audiovisual interactive communication devices. It also allowed for expanded use and of facilitators, especially if people were at home and the only person that may be able to assist them would be a family member who may not have gone through formal training, the waivers would grant them as long as the provider determined that the person was competent to assist, that they could do that. And then the other waiver was the removing the in-person initial client contact requirement. There was also a statutory provision that was waived, and that has been addressed and removed in Senate Bill 40 that passed. But we had requested those waivers. The governor granted the waivers on April 8th, 2020, that allowed us to implement that. And on April 9th, the department had posted the waivers and what that meant for each of the programs where waivers were granted. It's posted on our website, sent out through Gov Delivery emails trying to notify licensees about those changes and what those waivers were doing. And since that time, the providers have been providing services to clients in accordance with those waivers. So since April 2020, we did want to let you know that the telehealth waivers for our health programs are being rescinded. A rescission request was submitted July 20th, and that's been approved. So for the telehealth waivers that were granted for the hearing instrument fitters and dispensers program, those waivers will be terminated effective September 1st, 2021. The TDLR will be proposing telehealth rules for consideration and adoption by the Commission in terms of for telehealth rules and implementing Senate Bill 40, making updates to telehealth rules. But those permanent rules will be or anticipate to be adopted early 2022. So to ensure that there's not a gap and to prevent a gap in services and providing services via telehealth as you have been under those waivers that you've been doing for a year and 4 months now, we are proposing emergency rules that would allow the way that the services are being provided to telehealth to continue not under the waivers, but under emergency rules. Now, emergency rules are not used very often. There's restrictions on when you can use them. A state agency has to determine that there's imminent peril to public health, safety, or welfare. So it's kind of a limited and narrow focus of using emergency rules. The thing with emergency rules, you can agency can adopt them on no or very abbreviated notice. They don't go through the usual publishing the proposed rules in the Texas Register and having the 30-day public comment and having those discussions and input. You don't have that with emergency rules. They're adopted on an expedited basis. The other point, though, is with emergency rules is they're only effective for 120 days. They're temporary. And so they're effective for 120 days. You can have a one-time 60-day extension for a total of 180 days. So if an agency wants to make those rules permanent, they need to go through the standard rulemaking process with public comment and the regular process that you're used to with doing rulemaking. So for this, the department's determined that we are concerned about having a disruption of services to clients. You've been providing services for the last year and 4 months with telehealth under those waivers. We don't want there to be a gap in receiving services in telehealth. So we're proposing, recommending to the Commission to adopt emergency rules that will fill that gap between when the waivers expire September 1st and when permanent rules can be adopted, and again, early 2022. So that's what their purpose is, to continue what you've been doing, kind of continue the status quo, continue how you've been operating and providing services and clients receiving services since those waivers were granted. But instead of continuing those services through waivers, it'd be through emergency rules. So that's a little background in the waivers and the emergency rules. Do you have any questions or comments on that? Okay. If not, I can move towards the agenda item F, which are the emergency rules. And the emergency rules are under 112, Chapter 112, Subchapter P, Section 112.150. These were the joint rules, historically the joint rules that the hearing instrument fitters had with the speech language audiologist, speech language pathologist and audiologist. advisory boards as it relates to fitting and dispensing through hearing instruments through telepractice. One of the things that occurred during this session is Senate Bill 40 passed during the session, and it is kind of like TDLR's telehealth bill that put added telehealth provisions into our enabling statute under Texas Occupations Code Chapter 51. So it added provisions there. It's tied to also to Occupations Code Chapter 111, which is the telemedicine and telehealth provisions. And that bill also made changes to various health programs in terms of updating their statutes as well. And one of the changes that was made in that bill is it repealed what was traditionally known as the joint rules for telepractice for fitting and dispensing hearing instruments from both the hearing instrument fitters and dispensers statute under Occupation Code Chapter 402, and it removed that parallel provision over in the speech language pathologists and audiologists statute under Occupations Code Chapter 401. Just because those statutory provisions were repealed, the rules don't automatically go away. They're still in place until we amend or repeal them. What we need to do when you see the draft rules is we've removed those specific provisions, the specific statutory provisions, and updated the language because those provisions, that statute reused the word telepractice versus telehealth. So those are those updates there. So I'm going to share my screen with you all and pull up those rules. Okay. So these are the rules that I'm talking about. I just have to repeat. So what we were doing with the emergency rules was trying to translate the waivers, what the waivers were into the rule language, but we did have to recognize that these two provisions here, 402.2022 and 402.1023, have been repealed. So these rules aren't adopted pursuant to these sections. They are, we still have statutory authority under Chapter 51 and under Chapter 111, both of the Occupations Code. So that's a slight tweak that we had to make in doing the waivers, but the rest is to reflect the language of the waivers. And again, we had to reflect the language, the terminology that's used in the existing statutes. So just going through, that's what this first subsection A is just pulling out the removal. There's not joint rules anymore. You still have authority to have telehealth rules about fitting and dispensing hearing instruments or telehealth. So, and then we've updated this statute. The other change is here on telecommunications technology. We've added, this reflects the waiver, that smartphones or any audiovisual real-time two-way interactive communication systems qualifies as technology communication. Part of the issues was with the word telephone that it was in these rules. There didn't want to be any confusion that, because right now in the rules, telephone, email, facsimile are not considered telecommunication technology. They can be used adjuncts to telehealth, but they're not the primary use of providing telehealth services. So this was to clarify this change that traditional, telephone, email, fax don't count, but smartphones, that would be telecommunications technology. So we've made those changes here in telehealth. We had the reference to telepractice, that's been switched to telehealth. The definition of telepractice, the term has been changed to telehealth to consistency with term, but the definition has not changed. Down here in G, subsection G, where it's talking about the facilitators, G and H1, this is talking about the facilitators and having documented their qualifications, training, or competence if applicable. And then in H1 talking about performing those physical, administrative, other tasks for which the provider has trained the facilitator. These were the two provisions that were waived as it relates to allowing greater access and use of facilitators through the waiver. during COVID-19. You've got continue to have references with cleanup from changes to telehealth or to telepractice to telehealth. And then this was the other provision that was waived during the pandemic, is this requirement to have the initial contact with the provider. The client's initial contact with the provider has to be in person at the same physical location. That was waived during COVID-19 as part of the waiver to ensure that clients could still receive services. There wasn't this barrier that there would be an in-person initial contact. The language that we have substituted here replaces is language that was used in the speech language pathologist and audiologist rules, and the speech language pathologist had a similar rule, similar restriction that was replaced and amended a few years ago. And this language that we've carried forward here as a replacement is an L and an M. And what this is saying is the initial contact between the provider and the client may be at the same physical location or telehealth, but it's determined as appropriate by the provider. So it's still up to the provider's judgment in terms of whether that initial contact needs to be in person or it can be through telehealth. It also adds a provision about the provider considering relevant factors in terms of whether it's appropriate as it relates to that client in determining the appropriateness of providing telehealth services. Now, while this was the only part that was waived, there's still provisions that are in this rule section about that the standard of care for scope of standard of care for in-person versus telehealth has to be the same. That the provider needs to be comfortable and competent in providing services through telehealth. The equipment needs to be in good working order and appropriate for providing telehealth. So there's still those other protections that are in here in terms of whether it's appropriate to use telehealth, and that's being allowed to have the judgment be in the hands of the provider versus a blanket requirement that the initial contact must be in person. And especially during COVID, when this was requiring an initial contact be in person and businesses were shut down, people were staying at home, this would continue to allow clients. And then we've just relettered the rest. And again, just cleanups of reference. Yeah, that is an overview of these emergency rules. It's very narrow. And again, we've translated what the waivers were into emergency rules. As again, it was to continue the status quo for a finite period of time until we can adopt permanent rules and come back and update the telehealth rules on a permanent basis. So open that up for questions or comments.
Mr. Chairman, are you prepared to accept a motion, or are there any comments?
Just any comments or concerns or questions? I would just add a comment that I really appreciate Ms. Pello and Helica and Ms. Bryce. They were all kind enough I had some concerns and questions, and they were kind enough to refer me to section 112, 150 about the practice pieces and really talked me through my questions. So I'm certainly very comfortable and would very much entertain a motion unless there are questions. I know that I'm very impressed with the people on this board, and I know they want the best for the public and for the dispensers. And so I didn't know if there would be any questions or concerns or not. Mr. Francis.
Chairman Brian Francis, Executive Director with TDLR. Yeah, Wendy and them do a great job, and I told them to make sure that they had the new chairman training wheels on as they walked you through the conversation yesterday, and they said you had great questions and great feedback. This group has been just fantastic to work with. Dusty, Dustin, it's good to see you, man. Mr. Hahn wins an award every year, and Mr. Davila is the cleanest looking cat in the whole world. Ms. Trost, I know you're on the phone, so I appreciate the work, and this is transparent. I think, Wendy, we're going to have them back in a couple of weeks, right? And that'll be more of a traditional meeting with staff reports and more dialogue in the work group discussions that Mr. Davila talked about. But we appreciate y'all breaking out your schedules and being present to do this work. It's important, and I think your industry really has some great representatives. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Richard Davila, I would like to make a motion to accept the emergency rules on telehealth as written.
Thank you, Mr. Davila. Dusty, I saw you raised your hand, sir.
Yeah, I did, and I'm just fine with Richard's motion. But I just, out of curiosity, does anyone have any examples of? Because in my world, this doesn't have a large impact to what we do day to day, and I just want to have a little bit better understanding as to, let's say these emergency rules did not occur, and we went back to the old the telehealth rules that were are joint passed in both sets of acts. What? Anybody have any examples of things they wouldn't be able to do that they're doing now, or people that wouldn't be served? I mean, I just don't know what's happening out there in this regard. In the market I'm in, it's smaller, so I don't have we have trouble keeping people from beating our doors down, and and trouble getting them to wear a mask. So I'm in a bit of a different situation maybe than others. So I'm just wondering what's going on out there, and if this is if we have a lot of people needing like an unlicensed facilitator out there to get the job done and get people served. I didn't know what other people are seeing out there.
That's a great question. This is Brian Francis. I'll take the first shot at it. Number one, we can't rely on the old joint rules because that got repealed. So we have to do this, period. So that those rules aren't there to fall back on. So we're building that infrastructure. Number two, this is not mandatory. This is what I call just an extra arrow in the quiver for you, the licensees. So the best example I give is that if there's one licensed hearing instrument fitter that has a client that has benefited from this, this is going to allow them to continue to serve them that way. It's not opening the door and changing the game for you and your world that how you're doing it, but it's just to make sure that the client relationships, if any, and I'll emphasize that have been established, will be able to continue until we just match the rules up with statutory changes. And I'll turn it over to the experts in the room.
We're interested in continuing the telepractice, the telehealth that we're administrating. We have a lot of patients who are not interested in and have not been interested in the way COVID is going moving forward, may continue that same sentiment for wanting to have questions answered, have services provided via Zoom, via their mobile device or smartphones. And we are administering and servicing patients, I want to say every day, certainly every week in that capacity. And, continuing to be able to do that would be beneficial.
And just to be clear, I have no issue with it. I was just wondering if we had been hearing from people out there that were worried about this expiration or anything like that. So no, that satisfies me perfectly. And thank you, gentlemen. And I'm good there.
Mary Winston, TDLR, Mr. Potter, that was really great conversation. And to the experts, Mr. Davila, that's perfect. What we use, my husband's an engineer, and I say, it's always a pass down, right, to the next whatever. But for you guys and just the medical profession in general, it's continuity of care. And because these things are ending, we cannot rely on the old rules. Wendy will further, explain how this emergency rulemaking will allow us to move forward. As we know, and Mr. Potter, you will learn, we're so happy to have you, that rulemaking takes time. And so it has to go through so many steps that to be proactive so we don't lose that continuity of care for our licensees and their patients. This is what we're trying to do here. And I know Mr. Davila made a motion, and the next move should be a second or whatever. So I'm going to turn it back over to the presiding officer.
Thank you. Is there a second? Or is there any further discussion, I should say? If no further discussion, Mr. Davila made a motion. Is there a second?
Dustin Potter, I would second.
Thank you, Mr. Potter. And Halika, would you mind taking a vote for us, please?
Yes, sir. Presiding Officer Lance Brooks,
Agreed.
Mr. Richard Davila,
Aye. In favor.
Mr. Gary Hahn, You're muted, Mr. Hahn. I think you're saying yes. Sorry, Miss Amy Trost?
She's muted too.
Amy Trost, can you unmute your mic? Mr.
Come back to Ms. Trust.
Mr. Dustin Potter?
Agreed.
Try Amy one more time. Miss Amy Trost? Without her vote, the motion does not pass.
Do we have an alternative way to reach out to her? Or-
We do. We do. Hold on one second.
Got to tell you, I'm personally very excited we have a quorum.
We are reaching out to her right now, Mr. Brooks.
We can't reach her?
We are trying to.
Okay, thank you.
Angelica, how many
Yes, sir.
votes did you have for?
4. I need 5.
All right, I think she's going to log back in.
It's just a simple majority
Right,
vote,
right,
Angelica.
I'm sorry.
Simple majority.
right. As we have a quorum, and
So
so
the
we're
it's very
good.
simple.
The 4 carries it.
We want to hear from her. I kind of have an inkling of which way she's going to vote, but I can't vote for her. But we just need that simple majority, and we are good.
If we get, this is Wendy Pello, JLR. If we get a rack, we can update the vote. if
Definitely.
that's- yeah.
Okay.
Chairman,
Yes, ma'am.
I can move to item G if you would like, if you're ready
Please
to move
do
to the
so.
next. Okay. And G is just discussion of those next steps in adopting the emergency rules as permanent rules. Appreciate your time today, everyone being here. Appreciate your vote and your recommendation. The next steps will be there's a commission meeting scheduled for this coming Tuesday on August 10th. These emergency rules are on the agenda for their consideration. And
I'm here if you can hear
Okay.
me.
I will.
great.
Perfect, Amy. We
I
want
will
to
stop
get
here.
your vote.
We'll stop and
Yes, I agree. I agree.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Trist. And so that'll be the next steps if the commission takes action if they adopted and those emergency rules go into effect again. They're only effective for 120 days with the 60-day extension possibility or option for 180 days. So we will be coming back. And you have a meeting scheduled on August 25th. So in 2.5 weeks, we'll all be together again. And we'll have, as Mary said, we'll have more of a traditional kind of advisory board meeting that you're used to with, staff reports and kind of the traditional items. One of those will be the emergency rules and for a permanent basis, adopting those on a permanent basis as part of the emergency rules because they're limited in scope in terms to the waivers. But when we do go sending them through the permanent rulemaking process, we can also incorporate those into any changes we want to make from Senate Bill 40, which is the telehealth bill. And then any rule review changes or any cleanup changes from the department so they can be part of a broader discussion and broader comprehensive review of the telehealth rules, but those will be an element as well. But we will move on that. And so this will not be the last of the conversation, but those emergency rules will fill that gap to prevent any disruption in services from the termination of the waivers to the permanent rules. So that's kind of next steps for you all.
Very good. Thank you. Would there be any questions of anyone about that process? Mr. Francis.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have a question about that process, but before the day moves past this moment, I just want to just thank Wendy for her amazing hard work, and she'll be the first one to tell you, complete team effort with Katie and Angelica and Mary and so many other folks here at TDLR pitching in. But there's no doubt that Wendy is the one who takes the time to evaluate the crossing of the T's and the dotting of the I's and how much space is in between each letter on the page, and making sure that we're getting it done just right. And so I'm really grateful for her efforts. It means a lot to us, Wendy. So thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
then to the board, thank you all again for breaking out your busy
Yes.
schedules. I know y'all got a lot to do and you're taking care of patients. And for you to be here just says a lot about who you are as people. So thank y'all so much.
Mr. Chair, I also wanted to add, I want to thank all of our staff in the background who are pinging me and giving me very helpful advice for consideration. And we just are going to say for the record, because Amy did come in late, thank you, Mr. Steve Bruno, Government Relations Extraordinaire. We do have 5 affirmative votes for our motion that was given by Mr. Davila and seconded by Mr. Platter. And that's just for the record.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I would say, Mr. Francis, again, these ladies have been amazing in helping me with the new chair training wheels. They were truly amazing, and I had lots of questions for them. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, as Ms. Pello said, there is a meeting again on August 25th. And Angelica has told me that there is scheduled to be a quorum, and we would be getting together at 10 o'clock via the same methodology. So unless anyone has any further questions or issues, Mr. Davila, did I see you raise your hand, sir?
I'm good.
Okay, very good. Well, unless not hearing any, again, thank you so much. I'm excited to see a quorum and very much hope to see everyone again on August 25th. We are adjourned and I have 2:07. Thank you very much.